In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this vintage-styled AC30 cabinet. Since I don't ever seem to have a spare 10 grand laying around to spend on a vintage Fawn AC30, I decided to try to make something to approximate the look I was after. The Fawn look, the brass fence, the leather handles, and the finger-jointed 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood cabinet. Because I wasn't sure if this would actually turn out, I skipped filming a bunch of the preliminary woodworking steps. Just as a quick recap, I took measurements off my existing AC30 cabinets, a British-made TBX and a Chinese-made CC2, changed them a bit to incorporate a few of the vintage features I wanted to include in my own build, and as I wasn't sure which head I'd be putting inside, I erred on the side of keeping the rough dimensions and inner supports the size of my CC2 rather than the TBX, as the CC2 is actually built more like a vintage amp, with the head sliding in on a little tray, whereas the TBX head is a large metal box that mounts to the outsides of the cabinet in a completely different way. I cut down a 5x5 sheet of 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood into the sizes for the top, bottom, and sides. I ended up using CNC to cut router templates for the vents and the amp controls, and I also used CNC to cut the speaker apertures. I watched tutorials on how to do the circle cuts with a router, but I wanted the extra touch of leaving the cone protectors in place as well, so I relied on CNC for this. What I refer to as cone protectors have also been called high-frequency diffusers, but I think this was just an accidental upshot of having a protective piece of wood over the center of a speaker, rather than a feature, but I did it purely for the vintage aesthetic. I used my table saw to cut the finger joints, or box joints. I'd never done this before, so I referenced and re-referenced the Woodworking for Mere Mortals tutorial on this a lot as I went. There'll be a link in the description to that video. Box joints! But the basic idea is, in place of a single table saw blade, you use a dado stack, which is a number of blades pushed together on the spindle. You create a simple jig out of some plywood, based around the dimensions of the fingers you want. You line up your piece to this little nub. As you pass the wood through the dado stack, the opening is placed on the little nub. You cut all the way through one of your sides this way, then flip it over and butt it up against its adjoining piece, and proceed the same way. It should give you something like this. Two sides that fit into each other. There are tips in the video I mentioned on what to do if your fingers are too long or if the joint is too tight. Also, I should point out, cheap dado blades, like the ones I use, can be problematic. I realized way into my progress that the blades don't always line up the same, and the widths of the cuts can change, even if you use the same spacers, so be careful. I glued up the joints and clamped them as square as I could, referencing a speed square as I went, but because I had some chipping in my finger joints, I couldn't make it totally perfect. I found that this plywood is very prone to chipping out the back of the cuts. I actually ended up veneering new slivers of fingers on the outsides of the joints, where it was particularly bad. Then I used roundover bits to smooth out all the corners with my router. I used 3/8 on the front and back, but I only have a 1/4 inch spindle router, so I was limited on sizes I could find, so I ended up using a 5/8 on the sides, but it should have been 3/4. I used a thin curved table saw blade to cut the channel for the gold T-strip that goes across the front of the speaker baffle. The actual curve of this blade was about 2 millimeters, and the thickness of the widest point of the teeth on the T-strip came into around 2.3 millimeters. I could press that in with my fingers and it snapped quite snugly, so I went with that. The same blade was used for the channels around the outside of the cabinet that housed the gold string. This step was a bit tricky and a bit worrying. I wasn't sure about chip out even though I tested it, but I also needed to lean the cabinet forward to cut into those corners. Luckily it worked for all of them but one. I ended up needing to glue in part of another finger to fix it. Side note, in a lot of the videos I watched, many people have said to put a coat of Minwax paste on the top surface of table saws. I thought this was just a suggestion, but this step would have been a lot easier if I had. You can probably see the uneven, jerky sliding movement. I set marks for the Vox logo with this little jig I made. Luckily I had an actual Vox amp to take measurements off so I could get it fairly precise. I don't know if these are traditionally glued in or not, but I tried for a tight compression fit so the badge wouldn't fall out. It seemed to work. If you've seen any of my Red Special build videos, you know I'm a fan of Bob Ross and his black gesso. I end up using it on just about every project now somehow. In this case, it makes for a happy little baffle.
Just a little though, don't overdo, don't overdo.
I took apart my TBX cabinet to get a look at the inner supports. I mostly copied the placement from this amp, but I also combined a bit of the vintage style as well. I used the same 3/4 inch plywood in 3/4 inch square segments for these supports. I borrowed one of my Celestian Blue speakers out of the TBX cabinet, roughed out the placement, and marked the mounting hole positions. I'll be using number 10 T-nuts inlaid into the front of the baffle, so I drilled a pilot hole from the back to possibly avoid chip out on the front when I stepped up to a larger bit, but once the Forstner bit chewed everything up, I gave up worrying and just repainted it. After a long internal debate, and a long time scouring the internet for period-accurate Fawn Rexine, or a suitable replacement, and even designing my own and attempting to have it printed, I started to dig the bare wood look, and decided to try to match the vague color of the Fawn amp. I ended up mixing a few stains together and thinning them out until they gave me the color I was after. It ended up being a fairly light stain, but I also wiped it off immediately so it couldn't penetrate the wood and go darker than I wanted. That was a glue spot I didn't sand out apparently, but it's character. Minwax Paste Finishing Wax. Apparently my great-grandfather Pop-Up used this on everything. It seemed like a good endorsement to me. And I wanted that vintage furniture finish, so I went with it. The grill cloth was another area I wanted to customize. I wasn't a fan of the current Hershey's chocolate bar brown grill cloth with the fawn color cabinet. I wanted more of that coppery look from the vintage amps. The cloth I had at the moment was basically plastic, so after a lot of experimentation with different solvents, dyes, and paints, I wound up mixing some brown and orange acrylic paint together, thinning it out, and spraying it on the grill cloth with a disposable pre-val sprayer. Surprisingly, it was just thin enough to not completely coat the red, yellow, and green threads that make up the diamond pattern, but this was just luck. The painted cloth dried slightly more rigid than it was originally, but this helped with attaching it to the baffle. I could even crease it over the edges a bit. I read a great article on how to attempt this step, which I'll link to, but I'll try to summarize it as I go. First, I started in the upper right corner. I looked at the pattern and chose a spot that appeared to lay out evenly across the front face, and I left a bit of overhang at the top, above the channel for the gold strip. Started in the middle of one of the diamonds, vertically at the top, and slightly past the middle edge horizontally for the side, so it would be even when I stretched it to the other side. I put a few staples in the top position, then stretched the cloth down to the lower right corner, keeping the diamonds aligned vertically. This little clamp just put a bit of weight down at the bottom to hang everything level. I put the staples towards the back edge of the side of the baffle, to leave room for the white piping that goes towards the front. Then I stretched the cloth to the lower left side of the baffle, making sure to keep the diamonds aligned horizontally. Gave it a good tug and then put a few staples on the bottom side of that corner. Then I backtracked with the staples till I'm at the first corner. I came up with this fancy little way of folding the excess in the corner. It's just one finger, and then the other finger, and then the other finger, and then it's a hospital corner? No idea. Last corner. I took the cloth and pulled it diagonally to the top left, made sure all the diamonds lined up the same in all positions. Popped a few staples in, then finish off the side, down to another whatever those corners are called. Now it's time to cut off the excess cloth. A nice sharp, brand new Swan Morton number 10A scalpel blade is your best friend here. Now the tricky bit, or the bit I just guessed at, installing the gold T-strip. I did a bit of testing on some scrap wood and came up with this method. I'm not sure how Vox does it. The cloth was pretty taut at this point, so I just kept pressure on it up towards the top side of the amp. I snuck the scalpel into the channel, leaning it also towards the top of the amp, so as to keep as much material in the channel as possible. I made small incisions as I went, keeping the pressure on the cloth and feeding the gold strip into the channel. With the addition of the grill cloth, it was a pretty tight fit, so I used a rubber mallet to smack it into place. Installing the white piping is fairly self-explanatory. Staple it to the front and you're off. But I did end up with a bit of an issue after my first attempt. The initial placement of the actual piping, seen here, was too near the side of the baffle, and would not compress inside the cabinet with such a tight fit. So I ended up removing it and pushed it all slightly forward, so it would fold over the edge and hide the gap rather than clogging the gap on the sides. With the cloth, the piping, the gold strip, and the Vox logo in place, it was starting to look like an AC30. I installed the baffle into the front, but even after modifying the position of the white piping, it was still a very tight fit. But with a bit of encouragement, it eventually went. Feeling a bit excited to see it all come together, and pretty impatient at this point, I did a few things out of order so I could start putting all the little pieces on. I had installed a couple of the inner supports, but not all of them. I put 2 coats of the Minimax finishing paste on, buffed it by hand, and started working on the hardware. I bought these faux leather handles, which I like the look of, but in person they look a little cheap and too new for this amp, so I decided to try weathering them, just slightly. It's something I've seen Adam Savage do a lot of on his Tested YouTube channel, and I always like it, and I've been waiting for an excuse to try it. Basically just gave it all a light sanding, but tried not to make it look too uniform. So I bunched things up and moved things around as I went. I tacked the corners with steel wool, and then dripped a bit of the trusty Bob Ross black gesso into certain grooves,
Just a little.
and then wiped it out immediately. It just gave it a bit of that lived-in look, and subdued that bright white, false teeth-like threading. I installed the handles using number 8 T-nuts from below, inset much the same way as the speaker mounting screws. But I used brass slotted machine screws here. I think the slotted screw helped complete the vintage look. The brass fents are held in by a very light compression fit from those 2 prongs on the sides. I bent them out to fit the size of the openings, which I had completely guessed at when I cut them. Installing the gold string was pretty fun. For the front side, 1 staple underneath, then pull it taut to stretch it and have it slip into the channel I cut on the table saw. I've seen people using the head of a hammer to feed it in, so I gave that a try. A finger will work, but it can be a bit uneven. And why use a finger when you can use a hammer?
Alright, Pancho.
For the rear side, same job, except hide the staples under one of the rubber feet. Then I used brass finishing washers and number 8 wood screws to mount the back panels. Brass slotted screws, once again. I popped in the blue speakers from my TBX amp for the sake of documentation, and a few glamour shots. I didn't go all the way around on the top panel, as I haven't yet determined which head will be going in, and the mounting placement is different for each one, so that's my next job. The TBX head won't fit, and I wouldn't want to alter that amp anyway. My CC2 AC30 head will fit, but the purple control plate kinda clashes with the rest of the aesthetic, so I may end up building my own amp using a kit. All I need to do now is learn about electronics, and wiring, and amp building, but that's what YouTube's for. I'll post updates if I make progress on that front, but at this point, even if it's just a piece of furniture in the room, I'm pleased with the results. Hopefully this video comes in handy for someone. Thanks for watching.